If you listen closely, the walls of Brown Chapel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Selma, Alabama, tell stories. In 1965, the church opened its doors as a base of operation for the Southern Christian Leadership Council and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Brown Chapel AME served as the primary meeting place as these two groups crafted strategies and mobilized engagement in what would become known as the Selma Campaign for Voting Rights. It was from the steps of the church that Hosea Williams and John Lewis led 600 marchers across the Edmund Pettus Bridge to the massacre that would become known as Bloody Sunday. Televised images of the march and massacre brought the horrors of racial terrorism into the living rooms of the American public, as brutal images of bloodied and severely injured marchers dominated the evening news. I first walked the labyrinth of Brown Chapel's sacred halls as part of the 50th anniversary commemoration of the Selma marches in March 2015. I went to pay homage to the ancestors whose work laid the foundation for what I do today. I'm the founder of the FaithMatters Network, a nonprofit social justice collective committed to catalyzing the leadership of marginalized communities throughout the American South. As a young African-American clergywoman and AME minister, the significance of that space was not lost to me. You see, I am the fruit of the labor that resulted from the courageous work done by foot soldiers in the Selma movement and their counterparts in places like Greensboro, North Carolina, and Jackson, Mississippi. At 29 years old, I've never known the humiliation of entering into venues through the back entrance, nor have I been forced to contend with facilities defined by the myth of separate but equal. Yet, in a world where it is still controversial to claim that Black lives matter, progress must not be confused with victory. Television images have been replaced by viral videos of Black people dying at the hands of police. Walter Scott, Freddie Gray, Sandra Bland, Alton Sterling, Philando Castile. We say your names. My own story embodies the paradox of African-American progress in the decades following the fall of Jim and Jane Crow. By all conventional indicators, I've done well. Raised by two college-educated parents in a middle-class household, I had access to resources and opportunities that would be the envy of many. I went to great schools. I've consistently been able to secure employment. And unlike many of my sisters in ministry, I've been embraced by my faith community and supported through the ordination process. Despite my success, the sting of racism is never far away. The first time I was made to feel less than human because of the color of my skin was on the playground at school. I was 5 years old. On a daily basis, one of my white classmates teased and taunted me, declaring that I must be dirty, because why else would my skin be brown? The taunts escalated until one day, at the apex of the bullying, I was called a nigger for the first time. As a child, I knew very little about the complex history of race relations in the United States. I did know that my Blackness made me different, and for some folks, that wasn't a good thing. Throughout the years, class privilege did not protect me from the implicit and explicit racial bias I experienced in the many contexts I navigated. There were the microaggressions verbalized in college classrooms, where I was often asked to share the African-American cultural perspective on a particular issue, as if the opinions of the Black community were monolithic. There were the tense moments of verbal harassment, walking down streets and shopping with friends in communities where Black people had no business going. Today, My ministry cannot be separated from my commitment to equity. The first time I died, it was alongside 30 others on the floor of a Walgreens in Nashville, Tennessee. My death was part of a die-in, a direct action strategy that in the fall of 2014 became a signature of the broad coalition of organizations and local movements known as Black Lives Matter. The cool linoleum tile we laid upon is sacred ground. 5 years before the Selma marches, the Walgreens was a site of the Nashville Sit-in Campaign of 1960, a movement notable for its early emphasis on disciplined nonviolent resistance and success in desegregating 6 of the city's lunch counters in just over 3 months. Against the backdrop of racial terrorism and the death-dealing power of Jim and Jane Crow, these prophets of progress had the audacity to envision a better world and the courage to risk their lives to make that vision a reality. As I lay dying, I wonder what our movement predecessors would have thought of us, obstructing traffic to shut it down. It seems like every social movement in the United States has tried to stake its claim as the true heirs to the civil rights movement, as if the movement was a popular one. Let us not forget that Dr. King's famous letter from a Birmingham jail was not directed to white supremacists, but to the moderate majority that refused to take a stand. When Mike Brown was shot and killed by a white police officer in Ferguson, Missouri, it was a catalyzing reminder that progress is a process and not a destination. For over 4 hours, his body laid smoldering under the heat of the noonday sun, uncovered and exposed. His blood spattered on an altar of pavement, bearing public witness to a hushed truth that our elders in Selma and Nashville knew all too well. Justice has never been given freely. It has always required blood sacrifices from those bold enough to demand it. Our democracy is an unfinished building, which each new generation contributes to its construction, either by removing that which is oppressive and harmful, or contributing a new innovation that helps move us toward our vision of a more perfect union. There are those who condemn our contemporary acts of civic protest as a stain on the legacies of the young protesters who once occupied the ground we found ourselves sitting upon in Walgreens that day. It makes them uncomfortable, and that is exactly what it's meant to do. The two things that young people have always had are our voices and our bodies. Instead of sitting at lunch counters, we use our bodies to block traffic in the streets. The context may be different, but the acts of resistance we are expressing are variations on the same theme of liberation for all, which started all those years ago. The melody is different, but the heartbeat of justice is the same. We have moved from "we shall overcome" to "we gon' be all right," just as our elders moved from "follow the drinking gourd" to "ain't gonna let nobody turn me around." There is a myth perpetuated on cable news that millennial activists have no sense of our history. Many TV journalists believe we have no respect for institutions and don't understand the concept of leadership. They asked, who will be your MLK? Yet, our ethos of leadership emerges not from the model of a single charismatic leader, but flows from the belief that each of us has the power to transform our lives and communities. We've adopted the mantra of a lesser-known giant of the civil rights movement, Ella Baker, who noted that strong people do not need strong leaders. To understand our resistance to traditional institutions is to understand our context. As young adults who emerged into adolescence in the post-9/11 era, we are not naive about the challenges before us. Our social and political identities were shaped against ongoing narratives of war and religious conflict. Even the non-religious financial institutions that we were told to put our faith in because they were too big to fail faltered. Today, we as a nation find ourselves fighting a different type of war on our home front. It is a war over the vision of what our nation will become. At stake is the very soul of our nation, with battles being fought over kitchen tables and anonymous internet comment sections and at political rallies. As racial and religious demographics continue to shift in the direction of the United States becoming a majority-minority country, it has brought along with it the potential for positive transformation and a well of anxiety and fear. It is this fear of change and difference, coupled with the instability of our economy, which has caused some of us to retreat into tribalism, clinging closely to those with whom we have much in common. We read and watch media sources that only support our own opinions and biases. We live in communities with people like us. We demonize those who do not share our opinions. At its worst, this trend inflames our deeply held prejudices and leads to a violent scapegoating of those we brand other, thus robbing them of their humanity. The young activists who find themselves on the streets are not seeking to destroy or kill that which came before us, but to compost. We want to take that which is best and most nourishing from the institutions dying around us and cultivate a new vision of what our country can be. We know that none of us will be free until we're all free. Now, it would be easy to submit to the seduction of hopelessness in this moment and to cower in the face of uncertainty. But I'm a Christian, which means I'm a prisoner of hope. I believe in the possibility of transformation, salvation, and deliverance because they are the very stuff that comprise my faith. I know this path to freedom will not happen alone. It will require all of us to dig deep, bridge our divides, surface the best of ourselves, and give it to one another. It will require a naming of that which is right and wrong. It will require that we follow in the footsteps of the young leaders of the past and not allow our silence to become a betrayal of all of that which we hold dear. The very soul of our democracy is at stake. Which path will we choose?
Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining this vital conversation hosted by the General Commission on Religion and Race. My name is Reverend Jennifer Bailey, and I am eager to continue the conversation with you. Here are just a few things to know so you can participate in this evening's conversation. First, questions or reflections can be posted at the bottom of this page. You can also tweet or use the hashtag GCORR, that's GCORR, or post on GCOR's Facebook page. So let's get started. I've received a couple of questions already, and I'll begin there. The first question, and thank you so much for sending these in. If our church is an activist church, working towards equity and equality, how do we get young activists to come to church? Do we just show up at protests where they are? Some older folks may have physical limitations and not be able to get to protest. In that case, how do we come together to work together? Well, thank you first so much for that question. And for me, as I think about what it means to bridge the intergenerational divide in church space in the 21st century, it begins with thinking about expanding our definition of what it means to do church, right? In some cases, yes, that will mean folks coming to protest or showing up alongside activists. But I'd like to encourage us to think about the multitudes of ways that we can really leverage what it means to be church. You know, I think about that scripture where they say, where two or more are gathered, there will I be also. And in some cases, that will mean showing up to protest. In many cases, it might mean leveraging the resources of your church to do things like hosting community meetings, to offer space, to store supplies for folks who are out there in the field, to feed the weary, folks who are fighting the good fight. But at the core of all of these answers is really about building relationships and relationships of trust. And that can only be done when you get to know the person on the other side. And so those are just a few suggestions that I might have, but to this point, I think, which is so important of what it means to have folks coming to church, it really is, to me, about rethinking how we define the church. That could mean people coming into our congregations, but it can also mean spilling out into the streets or offering our physical space as sanctuary for young activists. Thank you so much for that question. The next question we've received, if contemporary acts of protest make my generation, those of us who grew up during the civil rights era, uncomfortable, how do we get to a way of protesting together where both young and old activists feel comfortable together? Wow, this is a challenging one. You know, it's my understanding and my own sort of narrative and experience of protest and activism that protest is never really comfortable. And when I think about the images from the 1960s of Dr. King and Ella Baker and Diane Nash and all of these, you know, huge figures in the civil rights movement, confronting things like water hoses and dogs, right? Protest wasn't a comfortable exercise then, and it certainly isn't now. But I think to the point of how we build bridges and bridging relationships that can help us do the work together, I think the first step is to really interrogate the source of our discomfort. And I don't think it's just older folks who are uncomfortable with the direct actions that young folks might be taking in the streets today. I think it's also about that question of how we build relationships of trust that allow us to first think about why we're uncomfortable in space together, and then ask the hard questions of what it means to build relationships, to get to know one another, to see one another, so that we no longer are coming to the space with a sense of suspicion, but understanding that we each are coming from a space of divine love in this work. And so, you know, I don't know that the work will ever be comfortable, because I think the work of social change is always difficult. And if done correctly, is moving us towards a new horizon, moving us towards a deeper sense of uncovering the unknown. And in that act, it won't be comfortable, but it invites us to be brave. It invites us to be brave as we explore these new horizons together. And if it's done well, if we do thicken our relationships with one another to feel held as we move towards a more collective vision of what love and hope can look like in this era. And a third question that's been received, do you have any suggestions about how we bust the myth that millennials have no sense or care about history? Oh man, if I had an hour, I don't know if I could answer this question adequately. You know, it's been very striking to me over the past several years to hear these messages in the media that, you know, if those young kids just knew the history of Dr. King, you know, how could they block the streets, right? And it's been interesting to me, particularly in my work alongside groups like the Movement for Black Lives, is that so much of our work, so much of our, what I would call liturgy, right, the chants, the protests, are rooted in a deep sense of history from folks like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. I think what's interesting is that, you know, we uplift figures in contemporary movements that might not be as well known, figures like Ella Baker, who said, you know, strong people don't need strong leaders. And what she meant by that is that everyone has the capability to do that. And so, you know, I think there's ways to demonstrate that through our signs, through the physical manifestations of how we show up in space. But I also think it goes back to this question of how we have conversations across generational lines that honor the urgency of the moment that we're in, and also point us towards a deeper sense and a deeper space of sharing stories both that are rooted in history, but also rooted in our own collective history of where we're at in this moment. So those are just a few quick suggestions that I have. You know, displaying the signs and quotes of history on our physical signs of protest, but also building relationships and having conversations that demonstrate our knowledge of history through our sharing of collective stories. And next question, what are microaggressions? Can you say more about the lunch counter experience? Thank you so much for that. Microaggressions, in my experience, are not those experiences of direct encounters of discrimination. It's not being called a name. It's things like assumptions that might be made about a particular racial group or people or variety of diversity markers that really point to an undermining, I would say, of one's humanity. So it might show up as, wow, that Black girl talking to me right now, she sounds so intelligent. She sounds so eloquent. And while it might come off, that assumption might come off as seeming like a compliment, what to interrogate underneath that is what would lead us to think that maybe I wouldn't be intelligent or eloquent, right? Microaggressions are those acts that sometimes really point to a stereotype that's going underneath our daily encounters. They aren't necessarily outward signs of violence, right? But can be experienced particularly by marginalized groups that way. Another question that we've received is young people and older people are not in the same spaces. Our lives and day-to-day are quite different. How do we and where do we come together to have important discussions like this one? Thanks for that. You know, for those of us who feel called to this work, feel called to this work of intergenerational conversations, it's true that I may not interact on a day-to-day basis with folks who are outside of my age group, who are not fellow millennials. But I think part of the challenge is how we create new spaces where spaces haven't existed already. And I think part of that's invitational. The church is a really amazing platform because one thing that we have, if we have nothing else, is space in many cases. So what would it look like for churches to open their doors, even if it's not during a formal service, to community meal, and to step outside of our comfort zone, to actually invite people, invite groups that we know in town who are doing work for justice into that space? Or better yet, what would it look like for us to go to those folks? Similarly, for young folks who may not have access to space, I think it's about us coming and finding spaces for us to sit at the feet of our elders and learn from their rich experiences. So that's going where folks are. If that's at a bingo game at a senior center, if that's, you know, in the space of the church, it will require some courage on our part to step outside of our notions and our own sort of sense of comfort to do so. But if the space doesn't already exist, I think we have to be bold enough to create it. Next question, is Jim and Jane Crow new terminology? I have never heard Jim and Jim Crow referred to as Jim and Jane Crow. Can you share more about that? So this is not new terminology. It certainly is stuff that I learned about in my textbooks, both in seminary and in undergrad. And the specific expression Jane Crow refers to the experience of African American women and other women of color under the sort of experience of segregation prior to the civil rights movement. And the naming of the particularity of Jane Crow is speaking to the particular horrors that women experience under segregation that aren't often written about in the history books. So we know Rosa Parks, for example, got her start as both a deaconess in the AME Church, which I'm very proud of as an AME, but organizing, being a community organizer in the South, organizing not around what we think of as traditional civil rights issues, but organizing around the issue of African American women who'd been raped by white men, which was a story that for many years was hidden underneath the rug, was not spoken about. The particularities of gender-based violence was not spoken about. So in reference to this question of Jane Crow, it's been added to in the lexicon Jim Crow to acknowledge the particular experiences of African American women and other women of color and the challenges that they face both at the intersection of race and gender and just the violence, the structural violence of those systems. Finally, another question, how do we create community with those with whom we disagree? Wow, y'all are, you're reading my story right now because that has been one of the biggest questions on my mind lately. I think particularly in the post-election moment, regardless of where you fall on the ideological spectrum or who you might have voted for in the last election, I think one thing that was very clear to me throughout the 2016 election cycle was the real rupture at the heart of our democracy. Our inability to see one another as humans, our inability to see one another beyond our echo chambers. And it's a challenge that I've found myself living with on a day-to-day basis because I also recognize that I live in my own bubble. And if I really want to bring about the kingdom of God here on earth and embrace that ethic in Mark 12 of loving my neighbor as myself, it means that I got to get to know my neighbors. One way that I found to be really helpful is actually working on a campaign that I recently launched in partnership with a few other organizations called 100 Days, 100 Dinners. And that campaign, which you can learn more about at www.100days100dinners.us, is all about this question of how we build and bridge across lines of difference in this moment. And it begins really with the radical idea that we need to build relationships. And so through the 100 Days, 100 Dinners campaign, we're doing that by hosting potluck dinners across the U.S. as a means to invite folks in. And the conversations aren't structured around politics, aren't structured around some of these partisan political issues. It's about getting to know one another and asking those core questions that really get to people's core motivations. Where does it hurt in this moment? Where are you hurting? Where did you learn what it meant to be a citizen? Who are your people? What are the communities to which you feel accountable? And I think when we begin from that position of getting to know one another through story, we can really move to a deeper space of acknowledgement. But again, it takes risk, it takes courage, it requires us to be brave and step outside of our comfort zone. And the final question that we have, if I can pull it up, is what ways might old soldiers support and embrace new movements? Black Lives Matter is just one example given here. Man, we need you, old soldiers. We need you. We need you. I think one of the things that, again, is a myth is that young folks have both no sense of our history and no desire to be in relationship with older saints. And one of the things that I've heard most often from fellow young activists is the desire to sit at the feet of elders, to learn from their experiences and from their stories. And so, you know, I think showing up, offering yourself as a resource, giving hugs, giving bottles of water at protests, those are all simple strategies, I think, to help us bridge that gap. That, unfortunately, is all the time that we have today. So thank you so much for joining the conversation. You can find resources on the website to support you in taking this conversation into your churches and communities. You know, our task of building beloved community is ongoing and can't be solved in a night or in a half an hour stretch, but is a lifetime work. And I just invite you to join the next Vital Conversations that are coming up. The next one will be held on February 21st with Caitlin Hansen, and that'll be about being an ally with people of color, for white folks in particular. So for more information, please visit the website, www.gcorr.org. Thank you so much. Blessings and peace to you.